Hi all, Dr. Clark here, and today for forest management, we're going to talk history of forest management. Um, I'm not a big stickler on knowing people's names, but when a course begins, and maybe you're not familiar with forest management in the United States, and that's why you're taking this course or watching this lecture, it's important to show kind of the roots of forest management, where it came from, kind of where it's maybe where it's going, and we'll get at that much later in the semester. But basically, where it came from, how did it originate? Um, for me, that's important. It's not necessarily, what's the middle name of the first chief of Forest Service. Okay, I'm not really interested in that. I'm interested in them as an individual and how they became a forest manager, or what did they do while they were a forest manager for the United States. Okay, and we're concentrating on the U.S. Now, just keep that in mind. I'll talk about this a little bit more, but lots of other countries had forest management before the United States. Okay, we're kind of late in the ball game. I mean, we got established late, but we're late in the ball game when it came to forest management also. And we'll talk more about that as we progress. All right, so the first individual that I want to talk about is Franklin Hough. Okay, and so we're talking Forest Service or Forest Division in the United States in kind of the mid 1800s. And that's where we're kind of talking about this. Now, he was the first chief of the U.S. Division of Forestry. So it was brand new, and he was the chief in from 1881 to 1883. You can see that he died pretty much right after that. Now, part of that has to do with the individual and how, not his death, but part of the reason why he only lasted 2 years was kind of what his background in forestry was. And that was none. Okay, so you have to realize the first chief of the U.S. Division of Forestry in the United States, okay, no background in forestry. For that matter, really, majority of the early divisions of the chiefs of the Division of Forestry had no background because the United States did not have any institutions, any universities that taught forestry. Okay? So he was a trained physician. At least he had, a scientific background, okay? And he had a general interest in botany. Okay? And the reason why he got into it was in the mid 1800s, there was a huge decline in the timber industry. Well, in available timber, especially in the eastern part of the United States. Early individuals, physicians, other individuals that were just interested in nature realized quickly that we'd cut all the forests down. We pretty much cut everything on the eastern part of the United States. If you could cut it, burn it. If you could cut it, turn it into paper, houses, whatever it was cut, and it was, and it was produced in a way that benefited society. The problem with all that is we never replanted anything. All right, so you just had these barren landscapes. Now maybe we cut it to make farmland. We'll get into that issue. We'll talk about other countries that are currently doing that right now. But some of it was not for farmland, and especially in the hilly regions and things like that. It was really just for product, and it was never replanted. Now it's been replanted, and we have some really beautiful forests on the eastern United States. But keep that in mind. The eastern United States, pretty much 99% of the forests were cut. So when we talk about old growth forests, when we talk about original primary trees, okay, trees that grew from seed and were not replanted, we're really talking about the western United States and a couple little teeny spots in the eastern part of the United States. Okay, so back to Franklin Hough. He was influential in the sense that he was part of the advancement of science, the Association for the Advancement of Science. So, like I said before, he was a trained physician. He had a scientific background. He had an interest in botany, and that was really what kind of gave him this opportunity to be the first chief of the U.S. Division of Forestry. In '76, Congress approved $2,000, okay, and appointed him to be the first forestry expert. Okay, so it wasn't really until '81, 5 years later or so, that he became the first chief. Okay? At first, he just got a little bit of money and he was a consultant. Okay? And so people asked him questions about, what should we do with this land? What should we do with harvesting of these trees and things like that? And so he was the very first forestry expert in the United States. All right, so in '81, he became the first chief. '83, he was demoted and replaced with Nathaniel Eggleston. Okay, and then he stepped down. Some suggest that he stepped down due to health reasons in '83 after he was demoted, but then he died in 1885, shortly after. He is regarded as the father of American forestry, although I think that could be debated, and probably is debated by people who work in the forestry industry. Yes, he was the first chief, but he wasn't trained, and he cared about trees. He cared about botany and the forest and things like that, and he tried to do his best, but again, he wasn't a trained forest manager and did very little for the United States forests. Okay, so he was replaced with Nathaniel Eggleston, and Eggleston is recognized as the second chief of the U.S. Division of Forestry. Okay. He lasted a little bit longer, 3 years. Okay. He was a minister by training, but as you might have talked about or might have heard in general biology, in the 1800s, religious entities, ministers, priests, monks, lots of religious individuals were interested in nature, and they were really the individuals that concentrated their efforts into documenting nature. Okay, at the time it was considered documenting all of God's creations. Okay, and so a lot of ministers, monks, etc., were very influential in the scientific community because that's what they're doing. They're actually scientists. They're actually, going out collecting data and things like that. So he was a minister by training, but again, he was interested in forest preservation. Okay? He realized also that right after the Industrial Revolution or during the Industrial Revolution, kind of that 1850s mark, 1860s mark, we were cutting everything. Cut all the trees down. The smog, the pollution was horrible. The water was awful. Okay, there's no filtration system, and there was nothing to build houses with. So you just had to keep moving west and cutting more trees and more forests. And so both the first chief and the second chief, they realized the problem, okay, but their hands were really tied. There was very little money, and the U.S. Division of Forestry had no land. Okay? So he was appointed by George Loring, the Commissioner of Agriculture. That's where the land kind of stood. Okay, was the U.S. Division of Forestry was underneath the Commissioner of Agriculture. Okay, and again, didn't last very long. We'd say that he shouldn't be recognized as the father of American forestry because he didn't do a very good job. The main problem with the first and second chief is they just weren't trained. Right? They didn't have the proper training. Sure, they had a scientific mind. Yes, they were interested in preservation of forests, but they they weren't suited for the job. Okay, so he was demoted in 1886, and he stayed on as a clerk for another 12 years. Okay, Bernard Fernow is probably the individual that should be recognized as the father of American forestry, mainly because he's the only one with any real training. Okay, so he's the third chief of the U.S. Division of Forestry. He was born in Prussia. This is probably why he doesn't get labeled the father of American forestry, is because he was foreign born. Right? But this gave him a distinct advantage. Because he was foreign born, he went to foreign colleges and he learned forestry. Okay? So like I said, American forestry was behind. Europe had already had it. Okay? Russia, that region, there was a lot of European countries that had already had universities offering forest management courses and things like that, because Europe had cut all their forests down prior to the 1850s. And so they really were training individuals to kind of bring those back, preserve forests, those kind of things. And so he got some education and came to the United States in 1876. All right, and until 1891, he was the only trained forester in the entire country. And so he was it. He became, the specialist, but he also he was it. He was the only trained individual. So when he said something, people took it as, hey, got to be right. He's the only one with college material, college degree, or college training. All right, so he was a chief until 1886, okay? And that's mainly because, sorry, let me back up. He was a chief in 1886, but like I said before, the Division of Forestry is not the forest department, okay? U.S. Forest Division, U.S. Forest Department, that came later. So it's just a division under the United States, and there was no land. They didn't buy any land. They didn't purchase any land. So management really came with advice to private ownership or advice to the ownership of the government, but it wasn't Fernow's land to manage. It was another division of the government, the Department of Interior, or another division that had that land, that purchased that land. So it was really, Fernow's opinion, hey, you should manage it this way, but really he didn't have that connection. Okay? So he didn't last too long either, because eventually what happened is we started to get more and more people that were trained, right, that were coming from Europe, and the U.S. Division of Forestry started expanding, and they started to realize that they needed to be their own department. They needed to get their own land and manage their own land. Okay? The reason why I say Fernow should be the father of forest management in the United States is because he was really the first person to approach management from a scientific standpoint as a trained scientist. Sure, a physician, a doctor has some scientific training, but not in botany or not in forest management. And, religious individuals at this time, they had some training in kind of natural history, how to name things and whatnot, but no real scientific approach to forest management. So he's really the first, and he did a lot of good things from a forest management point of view. Like, he really started to get colleges interested in forest management. And so this might have came at not a downfall to him, but he started giving college lectures and developing curriculum and things like that. So universities would start offering college courses in forest management because he wanted to expand across the nation, have a bunch more employees and whatnot. And he knew the only way to do that is get some people trained, and he couldn't do the training all by himself. Okay, so he worked on some acts that were pretty important, like reserve acts, to set aside land as either a reserve that had limited cutting or limited access. And then he also had a Forest Management Act in 1897, which suggested certain ways at which you should cut trees and limit clear cuts along rivers and things like that. That was early on. That was a suggestion by Fernow that we should leave more trees along rivers and borders between clear cut lands and another clear cut land. You should have a strip, which we often call buffer strips and things like that. So early on, there was a scientific approach. This all came from Europe because they had already destroyed most of their forests along the rivers, and they found out if you don't have trees along the rivers heat up. The water isn't as clean. It doesn't have a filtration system. Fish die, those kind of things. So early on, these suggestions were made. Doesn't mean they were necessarily adopted, but they were made. Okay, and so in 1898 he left. He kind of saw the writing on the wall, I guess you could say, because he didn't have any land to manage as the chief. He didn't see the point of having a chief, so he left to teach forestry at Cornell, and in his place came probably the most famous forest manager ever in the United States, and that would be Gifford Pinchot. Most of you probably have heard of Gifford Pinchot. If not what he did or who he was as a man or anything like that, you've probably drove over a pass on the western part of the United States and saw Pinchot Forest or Pinchot Wilderness Area or Pinchot Peak or lots of things. And that's really, it's named after Gifford Pinchot, but it's there because he acquired massive amounts of land. So Pinchot, early on in his career, his hands were tied, just like Fernow and the chiefs before him. But then with Theodore Roosevelt becoming president, Pinchot got a lot more. Pinchot and Theodore Roosevelt were friends. He got a lot more leeway to start purchasing land. So he's the fourth chief of the Division of Forestry. So he started off as the chief of Division of Forestry. But then when Theodore Roosevelt became president, he became the first chief of the Forest Service. Okay? And so he served that for 5 years. Again, early on in his career, in his life, he had a deep interest in forestry, but like I said before, there are no universities at the time where Pinchot was, getting his education. There's no universities that offer any degrees or even courses in forest management anywhere in the United States. So what did he do? He went to France, and he studied in France, got some forest management background, forest management material, and then he came back. Okay, and he came back as part of the National Forest Commission. Okay, so Fernow was still in as the third chief of the Division of Forestry. Pinchot replaced him, mainly because Fernow didn't see any changes. He didn't see that it was going to be a management position versus an advice position. Pinchot was okay with that because I think Pinchot knew that he could put a lot more effort in to getting it to a management position. So when Theodore Roosevelt was elevated to the presidency after McKinley was assassinated, Pinchot was moved into what we now know as the Forest Service, and is the first chief of the Forest Service. Now, Pinchot guided the Forest Service in a direction that was a little bit different than Fernow, but Pinchot mixed fairly well. He mixed scientific approaches with economic approaches. And so Pinchot, probably his most famous quote was, "For the greatest good, for the greatest number." Okay? And this basically was his approach to the Forest Service. This was his approach to land management. Is, look, we're going to manage these lands so you can cut trees, you can bird watch, you can, take horseback trips into them, you can hunt, you can fish, you can enjoy as much of the activities, as many activities as possible on this piece of land, but we're still going to get economic value out of it. So in other words, he kind of treated it like a tree farm. Right? So we're going to cut the trees down. We're going to reap the economic value for that. And then we're going to replant them at an economic loss, but clearly still profiting. And at the same time, you'll still have forests for your children to enjoy, your grandchildren to enjoy, their grandchildren, etc., etc. So he managed it kind of like a tree farm. So when we talk about Pinchot, Pinchot was a kind of a futuristic mind. So like I said, he wanted a forest for your grandchildren, your grandchildren's grandchildren, etc. Okay? So he wanted long-term decisions. He didn't want public, or I'm sorry, he didn't want private ownership of large sections of land. Instead, what he wanted is government ownership of large sections of land. And then the government can make long-term decisions, can cut this small portion this year, 5 years from then, cut this small portion, 5 years, cut this small portion, and make long-term decisions versus a private owner, which you don't know who's going to be the private owner, could just clear cut the entire thing, make it all grassland or make it all, range for cattle or farmland, etc. Pinchot was not interested in that position. Right? So like I said before, once he became the first chief of the Forest Service, he had a lot more leeway to start acquiring land. Now the Forest Service is an entity that had money, and you could start buying property or acquiring property underneath the Forest Service label. Okay? And so in 1905, the forest reserves consisted of 60 units, covering about 56 million acres. In 5 years under Pinchot, it increased to 150 units, covering 172 million acres. Okay? So really what he did is he got the Forest Service land. Okay? And so currently he is known as the father of American conservation. Okay? Because he believed in conserving the land for the greater good, for the greater number. We're going to combat that with another individual here in a second, okay? But this is a quote, another famous quote from Gifford Pinchot about his role as a forest manager. Okay? Without natural resources, life itself is impossible. From birth to death, natural resources transform for human use. Feed, cloth, shelter, transport us. Upon them we depend for every material necessity, comfort, convenience, and protection in our lives. Without abundant resources, prosperity is out of reach. Okay? So he realized really early on that the land and the resources on it were vital to human growth, to the human population growth of the United States. But he also realized if you don't conserve them and you waste them, then your growth will be nil. And actually, you'll probably have a decrease in growth. All right. Now we're going to talk about another individual, also very important from a forest management point of view, however, not part of the Forest Service or really any role with the Forest Service, and that is John Muir. Most of you probably heard of John Muir also. And if you don't know much about John Muir, at least you've probably heard of the Muir Trail, the Muir Highway. I mean, lots of things named after John Muir, Camp Muir. There's just lots of things named after him. Okay. John Muir was very different than the individuals that we've talked about thus far. Okay. I mean, yes, some of them were immigrants, but he's different in the role that he played. Okay. So he immigrated from Scotland, or his family immigrated from Scotland in 49. Okay. He enrolled in the University of Wisconsin-Madison in 62. Now, let me talk a little bit about John Muir's education, or the way he approached education. It's very different, and maybe some of you who are taking this course, it's the way that you approach education too. And I'm not saying that there's something wrong with it. I actually really think an approach like this is awesome. It just happens to be in our educational system, it doesn't work. Okay? John Muir's approach was he took courses he liked. That's it. He just took courses that he was interested in. So he was interested in forest management, forestry. So he took courses in it. He was interested in geology. So he took courses in it. He was also interested in poetry and writing. Right? So he took courses in them. Okay? And when it came about, that he went to school for roughly 4 years, at the end of his 4 years, he never accumulated enough courses in any degree program to ever get a degree. Okay? But from that standpoint, he is also very well-rounded. Okay? And you'll see by his approach to things. Okay? In 64, he went to Canada to avoid the draft. He didn't want to be drafted. Like many other young men, he escaped to a different country, went to Canada, and you can tell right now that's a different kind of personality. So he's going to be a little bit different than those forest managers that we talked about before. He worked on a sawmill in Lake Huron, okay, until 66, and then he returned to Indianapolis, where his family resided. Then in 67, he just decided that he was going to walk from Indiana to Florida. So he's just going to walk. Okay? And when he got to Florida, he decided that Florida wasn't really the place for him. So he was going to go to California. So he jumped on a boat and they took him to California. And in 68, when he got to California, he visited Yosemite for the very first time. Now you have to realize in the 1860s, 1870s, early on, there's parts of California and, well, parts of the West that you could still just lay claim to the land. Actually, quite a few places that you could just lay claim to the land, including Yosemite. So what John Muir did when he arrived at Yosemite, he just picked a spot and he started building a cabin. He built a cabin and he wrote his very first book while he was in Yosemite, the first summer in the Sierra. Okay? And so he is an excellent writer. He is an excellent poet. Okay? But then he was more than that. Okay? So he was more than just writing about nature and writing about beautiful places and the preservation of these places. He was also doing scientific research. So we'll get to some of his publications in a second. He was kind of a loner, traveled alone most of his life, and he was very frugal. He didn't spend money, he didn't have very much money. So you would always see him, said that you will always see him, and he was really just carrying a coffee cup, a little tin cup, okay, some bread, a little bit of tea, and then a copy of a book that he was interested in. Most of the time, it was, especially early on in his life, it was a book by Ralph Waldo Emerson, which was a Eastern United States writer who wrote about a lot of things that John Muir was interested in, and that was preserving nature. Okay? Emerson wrote about the destruction of nature and how we needed to preserve things and how beautiful places were prior to cutting all the trees down or allowing for industries to come in and dirty the water and those kind of things. Emerson and Muir met one time in Yosemite, and afterwards, so you'll have to put this in perspective. We're talking about the early 1900s. Okay? And it's a different time period for sure, because you'd never see this today. But after they met, Emerson was actually a professor at Harvard. And Emerson offered Muir a teaching position at Harvard. Just by meeting him once, reading his book, and talking to him about the ideas that Muir had, Emerson said, "Hey, you know what? I got a position for you at Harvard, and you can be a professor at Harvard." Well, Muir turned him down. Muir didn't want to be a professor. He didn't want that kind of lifestyle. Plus, he wanted to live in California. He wanted to live in the West. He didn't want to live in Boston. He didn't want to live where there were lots of people and where the destruction had already happened. He wanted to live in a place where it was pristine, it was preserved, and nature was what, in Muir's terms, would say, nature is what God intended it to be. Okay, so a lot of early writers and some even scientists and some people in the Forest Service would suggest that Muir was a dreamer. Okay, he wrote a lot of touchy-feely books and things like that about, needing spirituality and needing a place where you could pray and be spiritual without the destruction that man is known for. But he was a lot more than that. Okay? He wrote scientific articles, published scientific articles on glacier action, so glacier movement, on rock slides that were triggered by earthquakes, on the sequoia belt, so the giant sequoia trees that occur in California. He talked about why they occur. He was the first person to write on this, okay, why they occur in just a general section. Okay? So distribution, the ecology of the giant sequoia. He wrote quite a few scientific articles, and again, I have to go back to his education. His education was in forest management. It was, he did have courses in that. He did have courses in geology, so he could talk about glacier action and rock movement and things like that. But he also had excellent writing skills in poetry and English and etc. Even though he didn't have a degree, he was offered a teaching job at Harvard, and you can see that it's a different time, but it also shows you how special John Muir was. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about these two individuals together, because their path crossed quite often. So John Muir on the top there, and Gifford Pinchot below him. And the reason why their paths crossed a lot is because they had different views of the land and the use of the land. John Muir was a co-founder of the Sierra Club. Okay, and when Muir and Pinchot first got together, they recognized that both of them were talking about and both of them were interested in the general or overarching interests were the same, and that was preventing the destruction of forest habitat. Okay? Muir, on the other hand, wanted more. Okay? Muir is what we call a preservationist. Okay? And he would be what will probably be considered the father of preservation. Okay? Pinchot, on the other hand, was a conservationist. Okay? Now, the two are very different. If you're a preservationist, you believe that land, the natural habitat, should be closed off. It should be set aside. And yes, maybe you can view the land, you can be at the land, but you are not to disturb the land. And for surely, you're not to permanently change the landscape. Conservationists, more along the lines of, yes, utilize the land, take the resources from the land, but replenishes the resources as long as they're renewable, replenish the resources. If they're non-renewable, okay, use it, but use it in moderation so future generations have the possibility for that. Okay? So Pinchot viewed, like I said before, forestry as a tree farm, okay, and maintaining that tree farm for eternity, long term, okay, grandchildren, great grandchildren, on and on and on. Maintain your tree farm as long as you possibly can. Muir, he valued nature for its place on the landscape. He valued it as a place of prayer, inspiration, rest, and again, he believed that there should be no cutting of the trees on these sections of land, that they should all be just pristine and as nice as they were the day they were discovered. That was kind of Muir's value or his vision of what the landscape should look like. Well, they were friends at first. Okay, they differed based on preservation versus conservation, but then one key thing that made Muir and Pinchot go from friendship to more like enemies. I guess you could say enemies. I mean, they weren't hateful towards each other, maybe hateful a little bit in speech. Okay, but they were never getting in fist fights, that kind of thing. And that all started when Gifford Pinchot allowed for sheep to graze on forest reserves and forest management areas or forest land, Forest Service land. So Pinchot allowed for sheep to graze on forest land. Well, Muir realized what the damage that sheep could do to a landscape. In fact, some of you have probably heard the term mountain maggots. Okay? That term was from John Muir. John Muir coined the term mountain maggots to describe sheep. Okay? He also had a hate for cattle, okay, which he called prairie maggots. And basically, the term maggot really was to describe what they do to the landscape. They consume everything. They destroy the landscape. They eat everything down to bare ground. And Muir really had a problem with Pinchot allowing for sheep to be grazed or go on to Forest Service reserves. And that's where they struggled, and their friendship really ended, and it became more of a competition to see if they could get more preserves, more conservation, etc. And so the two kind of had a falling out. Later on, a man that I would consider probably the most influential in not just forest management, but game management, conservation, preservation, ecology in all the United States. And this man here. Yes, there's fathers of forestry service, fathers of conservation, etc. This individual deserves the credit of combining them all to be kind of a mindset of we shouldn't just protect a single species of tree. We shouldn't just, you know, we shouldn't just set aside a small tract of land because there's a river that has an endangered fish in it. He was more both preservationist and conservationist. And this is Aldo Leopold. This is the individual who wrote the book that you're reading, Sand County Almanac. And it, for those of you who are not taking the course, Sand County Almanac is an excellent read. He also is very poetic in his writing, but it's very deep, has very deep meaning. And if you read it today, even though it was written a very long time ago, okay, in 1946, I think is when he started writing it. Okay, it wasn't published until after his death, but you can see that today, in 2020, we're still dealing with the exact same issues that we as a society in the United States were dealing with in the 1940s. So although we progressed technologically wise, educational wise, okay, we haven't progressed in a lot of the issues regarding the environment. Actually, in many cases, people would argue we might even degressed on some of these issues. Okay? And Aldo Leopold writes about that. Okay? So he was an ecologist and an environmentalist. Okay? He's probably known as the father of the environmental movement, or father environmentalism. But Aldo had a little bit of a different background than the individuals that we talked about before. So again, when we're talking about Pinchot, we're talking about Fernow, we're talking about Muir, they occurred in a time period where education, there might have been a few courses in forest management at different universities, but for the most part, you were not getting a degree. Okay? In 1905, Aldo Leopold was accepted to Yale, and Yale had the first Forest Service degree or forest management degree. Okay? In 1909, he graduated from Yale with a degree in Forest Service. Okay? He was the very first class to do this. And basically, you graduate, here's your job, because there was no other institution that was granting forest degrees. Okay? And so when he graduated, they gave him a district, okay, and they gave him a place to work, and that was the Forest Service District number 3, Arizona and New Mexico territories. Think about that. In 1909, Aldo Leopold was in charge of District number 3, okay, in Arizona and New Mexico. Arizona and New Mexico weren't even states. They're still territories. Okay? And so that perspective of, moving to a region where it's not even a state, you don't actually even know what the boundaries are going to be because they're still just territories. Okay? But you know where the district boundaries is, the Forest Service boundaries is. Okay? And so Leopold, he managed it for a little while, and then he transferred in 1911 to northern New Mexico to the Carson National Forest. And so he was one of those individuals that was a very quick study, very good at his job, brought a lot of energy and drive to the system. So he moved up the ranks in the Forest Service very quickly. So from being in charge of a small district to being in charge of the entire national forest, Carson National Forest. Then, after managing the Carson National Forest for a while, he decided that he was going to switch gears Part of this has to do with raising his family. If you're, especially during this time, in the early 1900s, if you were in charge of a forest or a section of forest or something like that, the majority of your job was get on horseback, ride through the forest, checking things out, okay, managing the forest, um, telling people what tree to cut or what section to cut, examining the forest for forest fires, how much buildup of debris, these kind of things. So your job is basically away from home, especially in this time. So you're camping out. You're not, you're not able to travel back to your house every day. So you're going out. You're going out weeks at a time in some cases, depending on how big the forest is. You really don't have time to raise a family with your kids, have kids and things like that. So in 24, Leopold actually transferred to the U.S. Forest Products Laboratory in Madison, Wisconsin. Okay, so now he's in a role, he's in just one single region. Okay, now he's talking about, well, what trees are good for this product, what's the growth of these trees, these kind of things. This is some of the things that were talked about even in the 1920s, is still talked about today. What tree grows fast enough that we can cut it within, 5-10 years, make paper out of it, okay? What tree can we cut in 20 years and make lumber out of it? These kind of things were, ideas that were even talked about in the 1920s. In 1933, prior to 1933, okay, and really in 1930 or so, Aldo Leopold took a break from the Forest Service, okay, and he went to work basically for himself. Okay, so he took a break and dove into what he was most interested in, and at the time that was game management or wildlife. And so he went all over the Midwestern United States, Wisconsin, Minnesota, parts of North Dakota, South Dakota, Iowa. He went all over parts of the Midwest tracking game species. Okay? Their numbers, their nest production, if it's a bird, reproductive output, okay, mammals, how many, what's their birth rates, how many cubs or fawns or whatever the species is, how many babies are they reproducing, okay, and he's documenting all this, okay, documenting the habitat they live in, etc. And he publishes a book, and the University of Wisconsin-Madison kind of got wind of his work and what he was doing. So in 1933, he became a professor of game management for the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Okay? And so, like I said before, in 31, so, prior to this being a professor, he started making these reports, these game surveys of the north central states, and he just started pushing them out. People got wind of it, especially University of Wisconsin-Madison, thought, hey, no one's doing this. There is no game management positions, no game management universities anywhere in the United States. So just like the Forest Service, with Fernow starting classes and things like that, because nowhere was there any trained Forest Service individuals. Aldo Leopold started in forestry, worked his way up, decided, hey, we need not only forest management, we need game management. We need to be teaching this at the college level. Okay? And so he started. In 33, he finished his first book on management, game management. Okay? And in 1949, Sam County Almanac was finished. Although Leopold finished it, sent it off to publishers and was getting reviews and things like that, but he died prior to the actual first publication of his book. He died of a heart attack while fighting a fire, and so he didn't actually see Sam County Almanac become a book, but it's, as most people will realize today, it's a very famous book. Okay, Now, a couple things that I really like about Aldo Leopold, and you'll hear me talk more about Aldo Leopold throughout the semester, and I'll talk about Pinchot and Fernow too, but Aldo Leopold uh, was really the first individual to try to combine the two, to try to get them uh, connected. Forest management, game management. And that you can't have one without the other. Um, and that you should be managing things as a whole system versus little teeny pieces. Okay? And so he would write quotes like this. This is from Sand County Almanac. Okay? A thing is right when it tends to preserve the integrity, stability, and beauty of the biotic community. It is wrong when it tends otherwise. Okay? Conservation is getting nowhere because it is incompatible with our Abrahamic concept of land. Abuse of land because we regard it as a commodity belonging to us. When we see land as a community to which we belong, we may begin to use it with love and respect. This is really getting at the concepts that I'm going to present in this course, forest management. We will talk about managing a forest for multiple uses. We'll talk about the connection between forest management and game management, and it's really talking about recognizing the forest as a community, not a commodity. Okay, yes, we cut trees down, we utilize trees. They are a natural resource, they're a renewable resource, and they're great for the economy. But as long as we recognize that they're part of the community and we're part of the community, then we'll see that there are ways that we need to manage these lands, and there are ways that we need to get away from managing these lands. Okay? All right, so with that being said, next time I'll come back and we'll start diving in to a little bit of the nuts and bolts with forest management, the early stuff that you need to know when it comes to forest management.